We are here to keep the government sober. Our interest is not to see Jamaica fail. Our interest is not to leave a mess for another government to clean up. We're going to make sure that this government cleans up the mess they created. We tried hard in 4 years, given a recession, which by their pronouncement, and I want this to be absolutely understood, this government has no excuse about a recession. By their own pronouncement, the recession is over. They have no excuse about an uncooperative opposition. And let me just put it on the table. We are the people's loyal opposition. We make a covenant with the people of Jamaica. We have no covenant with this government. We have a covenant with the people of Jamaica. And we will continue to look for the best interest of the people of Jamaica. So the government has room to maneuver. And the IMF effectively saying to them, you have an opposition that has created the space for you to maneuver. A mature, progressive, positive opposition that stands as an alternative. You go and do the things that you said you could do. And let me remind you, the things aren't different. Tax reform, pension reform, wage bill management, public sector reform, and getting rid of loss-making enterprises. We took the blows in getting rid of loss-making enterprises. We paid a political price. Now let us see all those who claim that they have political capital with the poor and political capital and they own Jamaica. Let us see them use some of that political capital once and for all to build Jamaica. Some of these things we can only do by pointing out to you the figures. Minister Shaw went through and he told you about this argument about we broke it and they must fix it. About us increasing the debt. Well, the only way I know to deal with a lie is to present facts and figures. The only way I know how to deal with darkness is to shed light. So let us shed some light on some of the accusations made. Let us start, if you're going to talk about the economy, let us use the 4 main indicators of economic health. And let us see if we broke anything. So let us look at the 4 main indicators. Let us use, for example, exchange rate. I didn't really want to start in 1989, but that's a term of their government. That's what they inherited. That's what they got from a JLP government. The exchange rate at that time was $5.51. After they left government, they left it at 69.83. Those 2 figures don't really tell the story. What really tells the story is that every year the PNP government devalued the currency by 18.5%. Every year, on average, the currency devalued by 14.67. Sorry, I made it right. 18.5 years rather. For 18 and a half years, they devalued by 14.67%. What happened under our time? For our short time, the currency moved from 69.87 to 86.71. That resulted in 4 and a half years, call it, we devalued on average 5.2%. PNP devalued 14.67% per annum. Our devaluation per annum 5.2%. Who wrecked the economy? Who? Clearly, they had a far higher rate of devaluation. So we don't accept those false arguments. Let's look at another. Well, let's take a look. What has happened since they have taken government? Talking about wrecking the economy. We left in December 29th. The dollar was 86.61, 60. But for 2 years, it averaged around there. But that's where we left. Now, I want you to just look at what has happened to the dollar every day since the PNP has been in power. You notice the step movement? Look at this. This is May 8th. The dollar reached 87.46. The dollar is now 88.47. This is the weighted average BOJ rate. This is not what you're going to actually pay. If you go to most banks, you would probably pay more. This is a worrying trend that instead of the Minister of Finance coming to play politics, he should focus on stabilizing this dollar. Because the movement in the dollar is a precursor to inflation. And the PNP's model of economic management accepts inflation in trying to control capital flight. They make a trade-off with inflation. Inflation is the worst thing that can happen to the poor. Inflation is a tax on the poor, especially fixed income working people. Our economic model does not accept inflation. The PNP feels that if they don't give high interest rates, they can't get funds, and they will trade off for that inflation. That is why the PNP's model is high interest rate. We had to fight tooth and nail to reach a point where the policy was accepted that we should bring interest rate down. And as I stand here today, I don't believe that the PNP has truly understood the economic model to keep our interest rates low so that we can have stable exchange rate, we can have stable inflation rate. I don't believe they understand that model. Let us look at inflation. PNP is master of inflation. In 1989, inflation, 17.2%, reached its highest in 1991, 80.2%. And people forget about those years of hyperinflation. People behave as if, the PNP years were so glorious. But let's look at the figures. The average inflation for the PNP over their term was 19.68%. 19.68%. Well, let's look at the JLP's inflation rate. In the middle of a crisis, Minister, in the middle of a recession, our inflation rate on average for the 4 years was 11.68%. Compared to the PNP's 19.68, almost 20%. Now you tell me, who wrecked the economy? And they have the gall to come to the public to trick them again? We won't allow such tricks to stand. Then let's look at interest rates using the average treasury bill rate as the proxy. If you look at the PNP's term, interest rates went up to as high as 48.9%. Well, where in the world? And somehow we forget this. We behave as if, it never happened.
And bank rate was higher.
Bank rates, of course, were higher. I'm just using, this is what would be accepted as a proxy for interest rates. Their annual average treasury bill rate was 22.7%. 22.7%. Our rate, our interest rate, was on average per year 12%. Who wrecked the economy? And our lowest rate in 30 years, 6.47. We brought it down to that. Now, a lot of people say, and it's something that we have to accept because this is a talker here on the ground. Well, I don't use US dollar, so the rate don't affect me. And I don't go to the bank to borrow, so the rate don't affect me. That's the kind of talk you hear. Well, my friend, you might get a little more on the remittance when the dollar rise, but you're going to pay more for it at the shop, as you have already started to see. And very soon, you're going to realize that the dollar that you have, your Jamaican dollar, don't value anything against the American and Trinidadian and foreign goods that you have to buy. And then you're going to turn around to the government and say, listen, I need a wage increase. And we start this cycle again where the government say, all right, I'm going to give you the wage increase, and turn around and go and borrow the money. And that is the cycle in which we are in. You won't hear this truth from the PNP. But we find that the public has been misled, and our duty is to shed light on the disingenuous positions brought forward by the People's National Party. Let us look at the debt figures. Minister Shaw went through and he explained. And, I thought long and hard about coming to the public with the debt. But the debt is something and is another area in which we will give critical support to the government. The debt is a true national crisis. And like education and other areas in which we have offered critical support, we will offer critical support on managing the debt. That is a national crisis. If you look at the PNP's government in 1991, and you look at where the debt started, domestic debt. This is 11 billion to 513 billion when they left, domestic debt. The PNP government increased the domestic debt by 4,200%. Can you imagine that? 4,200%. That is an annual compounding rate of 26.6%. In other words, every year they add 26% to the debt. Who wrecked the economy? Let's look at what we did with domestic debt. Domestic debt increased by 43% under the 4 years of our administration. This compared to 4,200% under the PNP's administration. And of course, that was a 12.9% per annum rate of increase compounded. I want you to understand why I say that the debt is a national problem. Every government is going to be faced with borrowing as the easy way out if they do not have the political strength to confront the challenges, the inefficiencies, the inequities in our economy so that we don't have to resort to borrowing. Borrowing is the easy way out in the short term for our problem, but it is a long-term disaster. The problem that we are in now is that we are no longer in the short term. We are now approaching that long-term disaster. And governments must be strong to do what is necessary. That is why, having been to the depths, having seen the clear and present dangers, we are not going to play politics. It's a political risk we take. But we are going to mitigate the risk by explaining to the people of Jamaica what needs to be done and why we are the better alternative to do it. Let's look at the external debt. External debt, similar situation. The PNP increased the external debt by 1,100%. 1,100%. And then they have the nerve to come to us to talk about we increased debt. Right? That amounts to a 16.8% increase annually. The external debt increased by us 73%. 20% per annum increase.
Cheap money, multilateral.
And we have to explain that because we took a deliberate decision to seek cheaper source of financing. So if we're going to increase the debt, don't increase the debt by expensive money. If we had no alternative in the short term, we have no revenues and we have to borrow, then let's borrow smartly. And we had to do that. We were in a recession and we had to do that. And let's just look now at total debt. So if you took the debt overall, the PNP would have increased the debt by 1,900% overall. That is the overall increase, 1,900%. An annual compounded rate of 20.7% per annum. The debt under the JLP increased by 57%. Now, this 57% might be a little higher depending on where you draw the line. If you draw the line at the 29th of December, then this is it. If you draw it at the end of March, giving us the entire fiscal year as the government, then it might be about 60%. But I stop at this point to say that the Minister of Finance, whose words are not to be taken lightly, said in Parliament that the JLP doubled the debt. That is an absolute lie. Minister Shaw rose on a point of order, and we are not going to allow any of these untruths to stand. We will tackle each and every one of them as they are raised. This is the fact of the situation. You know, the argument has been raised about debt to GDP ratio. Some fundamental points must be made because in 1991-1992 fiscal year, the debt to GDP ratio almost reached 200%. A lot of talk now, it almost reached 200% under the PNP administration. They managed to bring it down in 1996, 1997. But it rose again starting in 2001, 2003, 2004 fiscal years. Why? Because of poor management with a high interest rate policy that caused the collapse of our banks. We are still paying back FinSAC debt today. It costs 40% of GDP to recover from FinSAC. That is the largest financial sector recovery in the world. So when we say that we need a commission of inquiry into this, it is not for political reasons only. But someone must account why the country had to take 40% of its GDP to pay for bad policies. Someone must account. And any ploy to smother that account will be met by absolute resistance by the opposition. The country must know what bad policies has done to us. Now, by virtue of the position we took, which was a very difficult position because we were in a recession. The debt to GDP ratio grew to 128%, which is 128, 129, or where it is now about 128%. And it will come back down, depending on what this government does. Well, it was at the highest in our year, 131%. And we started the process of bringing down the debt. On the debt issue, the country must not divide. On the debt issue, there needs to be an understanding of the people that the greater demands you make without an increase in productivity will mean an increase in debt. And we are not going to try and play the politics of poverty with debt. If this government has to borrow, it must borrow wisely. It must borrow smartly. It must seek to get the lowest interest rates possible. What we will be doing in the months coming is to examine the debt in more detail to see whether or not we were productive with the money we borrowed. Because borrowing is one thing, but squandering is another. And I think the country must know who has been more productive with their borrowing. And we are undertaking, as we speak, that study. I am tired of it, tired of the lies and the half-truths and the tricking of the Jamaican people. As an opposition, we commit to playing three roles. One is oversight, and no one can say that this government has not given, this opposition has not given critical oversight to government action. The Prime Minister felt it necessary to roll back the tax on electricity. Why? Maybe it's because of conscience, but certainly it is because the opposition was vocal and pinned her to a promise. As a result of that, the country's politics, I believe, reached a watershed. I doubt there would be any more politicians coming to give promises that they know they cannot fulfill. This opposition will be effective without being destructive. We will be critical but constructive. We will be truthful. And when we are wrong, we will say we are wrong. We hope for the best for Jamaica and its people. God bless Jamaica.